Hey everybody, welcome to another video review. Gonna get back into the flow of things. I got some statues in the background. As you can see, some very nice ones. And I'm gonna be talking about those in due time. But for tonight, I'm going to shift my focus to another thing that I've dearly loved for many, many years. So I apologize for the statue fans who have no interest in this. This is the definitive edition of the book Flight from the Dark. This is a game book, and it's book one of the Lone Wolf series, written by a gentleman named Joe Deaver. You can see here, it says Kai Series Book 1. It has a very long and storied history, 40 years old. It's one of the more popular game books, along with Fighting Fantasy, that really, sort of took the world by storm, I want to say in the 80s and 90s. And I read this when I was very, very young, probably even preteen. Really loved it. There's a very long history about its publication. It went out of print for quite a while. And then it was free to play online at projectaeon.com. And then popularity came back. A publisher named Mongoose decided to republish the entire series. At the time, there were 28 books, of which book 21 to 28 were very, very difficult to get. They were going to republish it, and they weren't able to make it. They went out of business, and it flipped from publisher to publisher until finally Joe Deaver himself took over, started his own publishing company. And tragically, Mr. Deaver passed away of cancer. And then, there was a lot of sadness, because at the time the assumption was that all these things were going to basically stop. But then his son, Ben, took over and has done a fabulous job. They're actually finished the original collector's edition that was begun by Mongoose. And while doing so, they decided to start a new series, a new publication that will be even better than the collector's edition that Mongoose was doing. And that will be all of the same format. That would include all of the errors that were fixed over the decades. And that also had some game balancing and, tiny additions and changes. And they called this the definitive edition. And so I'm holding in my hand Book 1, Flight from the Dark, definitive edition. I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about the actual book itself, in terms of the physical characteristics of it, and then I can delve a little bit deeper into the actual, the contents of the book. So the first thing that strikes you when you get this book is the size of it. You can see how my hand is right here. So normally, these type of game books are very small. So they're like paperback size. And in fact, most game books are only essentially available as paperbacks. They don't merit a hardback, printing run. Now for the Lone Wolf Collector's Edition, because it was a collector's edition, very special, they did actually print it as a hardcover, but the size was the size of a paperback. I'll go through my collector's edition collection at a later time. I do have all of them actually. And during that time, I can give you the story of Mongoose Publishing in a bit more detail. But for now, suffice to say that the original collector's edition, while hardcover and in pretty good quality, is still small. So the thing that's amazing about this book is that it's not only hardcover, hardbound, hardback, but the size is basically like the size of a regular hardback. Obviously there are hardcovers that are bigger than this, but it's certainly not like ridiculously small. It's not paperback size, in other words. So one of the immediate implications of that is that I'm holding it in my hand so you can get a feel for how big this is that when you read it, it's just a lot more comfortable to read. It's a joy to read, and because for people who are game book aficionados who love game books, you have to understand that normally we're not used to reading a game book that's this comfortable, that's this size. We're used to reading paperback-sized versions. It kind of you have to fit in the palm of your hand. You're flipping. It's a little bit cramped. So it really was a pretty amazing and really cool experience to read the book like this. So that's number one. Another thing is that kind of funny is that you have a hard time reading it in bed. For me, at least, when I used to do these game books, I would just kind of relax. I mean, I didn't do it like really seriously. I wasn't making maps or anything like that. And so when I read these books, I do it in bed, just kind of flipping through. And you can do that, of course, with the paperbacks. But this book was really hard to do in bed. I mean, I read part of it in bed, but it does put a lot of it's really heavy. It does put a lot of strain on your wrist. And so I think kind of like the best way to read it is what I'm doing right now when I'm reviewing it, which is sitting at a table, have your paper, your pencils ready. It's just a lot more fun, a lot more pleasurable reading it that way. So that is a minor kind of, I guess, drawback of the size and weight, is you really can't read it in bed, but in every other respect, it's a much better experience reading it like this. So that's number one. Number two, because this is a game book, as you guys know, you can see that there's many different sections and things like that. So you're constantly flipping pages, back and forth from one section to the other. And so immediately you find out that the paper quality here is excellent paper quality. Each page is, you can feel the thickness, of the page as you're flipping back and forth. It's not going to rip very easily. So quality of the book, even with the quality of the paper, is very, very good. If you look up here, you can see the binding, is very, very good quality binding. You can tell that the pages aren't going to fall apart or rip out, like if the glue weakens or whatnot. So this is, very, very good, good binding, so to speak. And it also comes with a black and a gold, ribbon that you can use to keep your place in the book. And it comes with two of them. So, anyone who's read a game book knows the so-called, the cheating where you put a finger to keep the section as you flip to see what happens. Is it really cheating? I don't know. I mean, everybody does it, but it's almost like they recognize that that's what you do. So instead of the fingers, you can use the ribbon to kind of keep your place as you're flipping back and forth, which is really cool because usually there's multiple sections and you use that to keep track. So that's really nice. The actual cover itself, the cover jacket, is also extremely high quality. You can feel it's very glossy, very thick, and it's actually you can't tell, but the entire title is in relief. So it's actually you can actually feel the title sort of jutting out of the dust jacket, which is a really, really classy touch. Okay, so you can actually feel it coming out. There's actually texture to this, and the same thing on the side. This is all in relief. You can feel the lone wolf logo over here. So all of this, you can feel that. Okay, it's kind of again in relief coming out, which is not something I've actually ever really seen in many paperbacks. And even the detailing. Every time you see the sigil and the title, if you just run your finger over it, you can feel it again coming out, and then that's it here. Okay, and then you can see it's by Holmgard Press. All of this is very nice. You can feel the Kai also coming out. And then if you take the dust jacket off, this is what it looks like. You can have the symbol right here in gold leaf. And then here again is the title. So this is all just amazing quality. And then you can see that the dust jacket, on the undersurface of the dust jacket, is a full color map of the last lands, and just really, really gorgeous work. Okay, so definitely in terms of the quality of this book, I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is the best quality game book I've ever I've ever owned. And it's honestly like better quality than just any normal hardback. I mean, there are limited edition volumes, like leather bound volumes of books I've owned, but those are like hundreds of dollars each, and they're limited edition. So the amount of quality and love and care that went into this particular edition is off the charts. It's actually stunning. And so again, from a physical characteristic point of view, this is amazing. I don't know how much it cost. I want to say it's something like 25 British pounds sterling. The publisher is based in the UK. And so, it's not cheap. It's definitely, somewhat pricey. But for like a Lone Wolf fan, it's definitely worth every penny. You get what you pay for. And it's definitely, again, a joy to hold, to read. No complaints at all about the physical characteristics. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the actual book itself, and if you can take a look at it, I want to let you know that I've read this book basically from cover to cover, completely explored essentially almost every single tree. And even after reading it, it's still in really darn good shape. Okay, I don't know if you can appreciate that, but I mean, of course I read it carefully. I do love books, I read it carefully. But think about it, I mean, it has 550 sections, and you're constantly flipping back and forth, back and forth. And so for this book to have been read the way I read it and still look as good as it does, again, speaks to the quality of it. All right, so now that we've gone through the book itself, let's talk about the content. What's so great about Lone Wolf for this book? What's great about it is that Joe Deaver is actually an amazing writer and an amazing storyteller. Just like Sir Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson from the Fighting Fantasy, series of books. His Joe Deaver's legacy goes way, way back. He was one of the first people to create these types of game books. And apologize now because I'm going to be talking a lot, and all you're going to see is basically this book cover. So hopefully you really love the cover art. This is, by the way, cover art made just for the definitive edition, and you can see just how beautiful this cover art is actually. So while I'm talking about the book and reviewing it, you can enjoy looking at all the details of this cover art. So in any case, Joe Deaver, along with Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, came from a generation where they kind of began the game book craze in its infancy. They were the pioneers. And Joe Deaver, I think, won some sort of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons award for being like the best dungeon master or something like that, winning the best campaign. And so he took like the quality of the prose to a different level. He was just an amazing storyteller, an amazing writer. And there was just something about reading, Lone Wolf that immersed you a bit more, because sometimes for like Fighting Fantasy, the quality of the writing was kind of like mediocre. It was average because that wasn't the focus necessarily of these game books. They were churning them out quite frequently. But Joe Deaver's work was a notch above. You can clearly feel that in terms of the world building, in terms of the characterizations, the detail. There was just an epic scope to it, and a depth to not just the world building, but the writing that distinguished him. Okay, so really loved that part. And without giving, I guess spoiler review, this is a 40-year-old book. So if you're going to go ahead and get it, go for it, but I'm not going to spoil something that's 40 years old. So we're going to get in a little bit depth. So essentially, it starts you off in this really amazing way. You are like the last member of an order of monastic, like monks, like monastic warriors called the Kai. Your monastery was attacked, sneak attacked, and while you were out, I guess, gathering firewood, you escaped by sheer luck, and then your monastery was razed to the ground. And it's your job to essentially warn the king of your country about this attack. And that's the premise of the first book. Very exciting. Again, very open-ended, actually, compared to some of the later books in the series. And what strikes you is the tension, because as you start off, you're this very young, inexperienced warrior, not really even a warrior. You're like an initiate, and you're just trying to survive to get to the capital of your country to warn the king. So it's like an amazing story. It started off just right. You're looking at it through the eyes of, again, a very young and scared Kai initiate, and it really sucks you into the story. And at the end of the story, it immediately asks you if you're ready to move on to Volume 2, Fire on the Water, which is, again, something very different, because normally for games like Fighting Fantasy or Choose Your Own Adventure, they're essentially episodic, but they don't tell one cohesive story. It's just like kind of the monster of the week, separate stories, separate adventures, even written by different authors. Whereas here, these game books, while they're played separately, they combine to sort of create this huge epic. And you can carry over the equipment and the information and the things you do from one book to the next. And so it weaves this huge epic story all together, which was essentially very, very unique, and still is unique. Most game book authors don't have that ambition. They don't tell a story quite like that in game book format. So that's the original Flight from the Dark. Now, many years later, when Mongoose Publishing decided to publish the collector's edition of Flight from the Dark and to reprint it, Mr. Deaver at that time took it upon himself to add a little something to the story, I suppose, to make it worth buying. Although I think in retrospect, he didn't really need to have done that, because there was so much love for these books and for the opportunity to own like a hardcover, beautifully, bound version of this, and with new artwork and all of that. That was more than enough for a lot of us to just buy it. But at the time, he couldn't have known that. The publisher didn't know that, so they wanted to, again, embellish and to add something. And I think, to be fair, also, Mr. Deaver always maybe had this conceit that he did want to make the first book a little bit better. He wanted to change it a little bit more. He wanted to add a bit more detail. At the time, he couldn't because of the constraints of the business model of publishing. He was essentially limited to only 350 sections per book. And so he took the opportunity after while he was for the republishing, to rewrite portions of the book and add to it. And the new book, Flight from the Dark, the collector's edition, had actually 550 sections. It had an extra 200 sections, which is, that's gargantuan. I mean, that's essentially over, if you do roughly, the rough math is over, 75% of the length of the original. It's increased it by over 70%. And one of the things that he decided to do was that rather than just having you, start Flight from the Dark in the aftermath of the Kai monastery's fall and the slaughter of your brothers, of your fellow Kai, brethren, he decided to start the collector's edition, the new version, so to speak, with you in the monastery, and you had the opportunity to sort of see the fall from the ground up, so to speak, and you were involved in the defense, that doomed defense of the monastery. And that was where the bulk of the extra sections was added. I believe well over 50 to 75, maybe more sections was again showing you the fall of that monastery. And then he made certain changes, again, to the to the flow of the book. And I think I read that once, like over 10 years ago, long time ago. I kind of forgot about it. And at the time, I just read it and said, okay, cool. And I went through it, and I enjoyed it, and I didn't think too much more of it. Of course, the collector's editions became more and more valuable, and so I didn't read Lone Wolf again for quite a while. It's been decades since I read it. But with the release of the definitive edition, I decided, okay, this is my opportunity. I'm not only going to just read it, but now no longer from the point of view of like a teenager, but now I'm a 47-year-old man, which is kind of a trip. Almost over 35 years later, I'm going to read it from the perspective of a grown person. And I'm going to read it and really know it. I'm going to fill out the adventure sheet. And so let's see how I feel about that. So I actually took the time to print out the adventure sheet. They have a link in the computer, so it's really nice. You don't have to dirty the adventure sheet. And these are some of the notes that you're going to be using. This is all of the, tracking all of the numbers and that type of thing. And then this is the roadmap that I created. In my opinion, the optimum roadmap to get to the very end. So as you can see, it's a monstrous book. It went from, I remembered reading the original Flight from the Dark, and even, I just remember thinking it wasn't that bad. It was tricky, but certainly nothing near some of the more diabolic fighting fantasy novels written by, say, Jonathan Green or Steve Jackson. But going back and reading, Joe Dever's expanded edition, it was just incredibly difficult. Long book. This is like exceptional in terms of length. Length and difficulty. And so, when I ran through the entire adventure, there was a couple of observations that I made. I think that making the book longer is definitely a good thing. It's just more content, and it's kind of fun to play. But some of the other mature or adult fans have commented on this, and I think I do kind of tend to agree, is that very similarly to how George Lucas wanted to go back to his original Star Wars trilogy and try to quote unquote touch things up and correct perceived mistakes and limitations that he was laboring under at the time. There's something to be said for that, I suppose. But I think there's another perspective where sometimes, you really can't go back and turn back time, right, so to speak. There's a special magic to what was written at the time. The Joe Dever that wrote the extra longer version of Flight from the Dark is a very different person, I think, than the Joe Dever who originally wrote the original version. Maybe different perspective. And when you do these things, it kind of changes things. It kind of maybe messes things up a little bit. And while I think that, from a gameplay perspective, those extra 200 sections added a lot of fun and depth to the book, I think from a narrative perspective, it doesn't quite do as much as you would think it does. And this is sort of one of the things which I don't want to get too sidetracked by, but it again delves into the whole idea of sometimes telling too much, right? Like, since we're on the Star Wars analogy, it's like that situation when, George Lucas revisited the Star Wars universe and told those prequels, episodes 1, 2, 3, and Red Letter Media, which did a bunch of hilarious, YouTube commentary on those 3 movies and why they were so bad. They said something. It's just a throwaway line or a throwaway couple of minutes, but it really stuck with me because it ran so true to me. Is that why do we even need the prequels? The whole prequels wanted to detail in excruciating agony the reason why Anakin Skywalker fell and became Darth Vader. And some of those reasons were pretty cringy. They weren't as deep or as, operatic or as Wagnerian, as Lucas maybe thought it was. And at the end of the day, it's like maybe the reason that a character like Boba Fett or a character like Darth Vader is so cool is the mystery surrounding it. And maybe you don't really need to know more than just what was presented to you in the original trilogy. And that sometimes by going into excruciating detail, you actually lose a lot of the magic and you lose a lot of the mystique and you actually damage in a way, the character. And so similarly with Flight from the Dark, I don't think that it was really necessary to show in greater detail the fall of the monastery. And comparing the two, I feel like it was enough to wake up and just be told, hey, this is who you are, this is the order, this is the monastery, they're all dead. And now go. There was a remarkable tension and urgency to that, which is sort of taken away when you spend, like so long actually going into the nitty gritty and the gruesome, so to speak, details, the gory details of how that monastery fell. And I do feel like it kind of hurt to some degree the pacing, of the narrative and took away a little bit of that tension and that urgency as you're kind of stuck in the monastery. And there's a little bit of just, again, that prequel-itis, which is like, well, what's going to happen. And so a lot of the characters that you wind up meeting, it's just like you already know they're all going to die, right? Because you know that nobody survives. So a bit of the tension does leak out. And there's a little bit of, I think, credibility or believability as well, because, in the book, you're tasked to light this beacon that's going to let the king in Holmgard know that you're being attacked. But that kind of steals a little bit of the purpose of the original book, because in the original book there was no warning, there was no beacon, and so you were the only thing that could warn the king. So the fact that for this revised edition, you already, before the original version even started, now that you're in the monastery, it's fallen, and before it falls, you already warned the king. It kind of messes with the motivation again a little bit. Supposedly, you still have to go to the king to give him, I guess, the gory details about how this happened, and also to let him know that none of the other Kai survived. I'm the only survivor. But it does take away quite a bit from this, right? Because of this edition. So there's that. There was also a lot more embellishment in terms of the journey to the capital. The capital of the Somlending or Holmgard, because in the original book, again, there was a lot more flow. He only had 350 sections to deal with. That was a very real limitation, and so you had to keep moving. And here, Joe Deaver in the revised edition took his time, really embellishing the details. And again, sometimes maybe as just like a bit of it detracted in a way from the flow. There was one section where you're trying to save a little village, and you spend quite a bit of time there. There's another section where you're going into the ruins of these plague lords, and you spend a lot of time in detail there. All of these things weren't really expanded upon in the original book. Remember, those 200 sections came from somewhere. And in a sense, when I read it, though, it felt a little bit, I guess, just there was a little bit of problems when I was reading it in terms of the feeling, because when you read the original Flight from the Dark, it really honestly feels like, in case you don't know, Lone Wolf is 15 years old at the beginning of Flight from the Dark. And when you're reading it, you could definitely believe that he's just 15 years old, scared out of his mind, desperate, trying to reach, Holmgard. Whereas here, there's this incongruency, there's this discordance, because part of it is there, but because of, Joe is now writing this decades later, after he has written 27 other novels with Lone Wolf, there's aspects of Lone Wolf that feels kind of like inappropriately or weirdly, mature. Like, you wouldn't expect a 15-year-old to stop and be able to save, Fogwood, the city. you wouldn't expect him to go so deep into the plague lord's little base or hidden fortress, and some of the narrative kind of attributing your thoughts and emotions seem more consistent with the lone wolf of maybe of a Kai Lord or Kai Master. It seems more consistent with the lone wolf of book 13 to 20 than a lone wolf of book 1, if you take my meaning. And so that's again sort of this situation where it's a weird amalgamation of like the young, innocent, inexperienced lone wolf and another version of lone wolf that's almost like he came back from the future, right? And that's what the extra 200 sections feels like. It feels like lone wolf traveled back from the future, and it's a different lone wolf in some sections. So that's kind of how I felt when I read it. I think it's still, of course, a blast, and parts of the expansion, of course, there's more expanded lore, more detail, and that's amazing. I really love that. But it's not all pros. It's not all good. Those are some of the negatives of coming back and trying to rework things, to rework the writing of even yourself, but 20, 30 years younger. Okay, so that's my overall review of Flight from the Dark, both the actual book itself and also the contents of the book. And this is the only one that he added or he wrote extra sections. I mean, he didn't do it with any of the other books, and it could be because of time, or maybe just because as time went on, he was just more satisfied with what was released. But it's interesting that he amended the first book to such a gargantuan degree. I mean, 200 sections, and then basically really very touched very little on the rest of the books in those releases. So I thought that was really interesting that happened. And in terms of difficulty, again, another thing about this is I feel like it's a little bit imbalanced in the sense that there are a couple of fights in the book where the challenge rating or the combat skill of your enemy is just completely, like in my opinion, ridiculous and off the charts. There's a monster called a Gorgaz, which you meet on a bridge in the middle of this book, and it's got a challenge rating of 20. For comparison, if you roll a maximum roll for your character for Lone Wolf, maximum roll is like a 19. And then if you have certain weapon skills, if you pick up a shield, you can maybe bump it up to 22, 23s. But that's like the max, right? And most normal people, if you don't cheat, you're not going to get like a 9, right? And this thing is already a 20, which means that even at maximum, you're still barely even with this monster. And you have to fight that monster to progress in the game book at a probably 95% chance. There's only one path to not have to fight that monster. It's a very, very difficult path to find. And then at the end of the book, in the original version of Flight from the Dark, you're just finished the book. You get taken to the king. Congrats, you made it. In this book, you have to fight like another boss at the very end. That was not in the original edition. And it's like a Hellgast, and its challenge rating is like a 22 or something like that. And I think its endurance is like a 30. So how can you ask the player to fight a enemy that's that overpowered? Where, I mean, if you're going to play it fair and square, if you don't cheat, there's a really, really good chance that you're going to just get obliterated. I mean, you're going to get killed at the very end of the novel. So I'm a little bit confused about why they made why that decision was made, and what the sort of rationale behind it was. Because for sure, from a game balance point of view, that was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, unless again you're walking into it with like you got a shield, you're going to drink the potion of strength, and even more dismaying, to fight that Hellgast you need a magic weapon. So your sword won't do. You have to give up your sword, and then you have to pick up like a magic dagger, which is great, except that you don't have a weapon skill with the dagger. And so if you happen not to have a weapon skill with the dagger, you lose that bonus, and it's just a very, very difficult fight. And so it kind of makes this little preamble where it says that if you even roll like really low scores for your character in the beginning of the movie, not the movie, the beginning of the book, you should still be able to finish the book completely nonsensical, because there's two choke points, and one of them at the very, very end of the book, where unless you're lucky, even with maximum stats, you just have to be lucky just to survive. So that is kind of a significant problem with book one. And it's only a problem with the collector's edition and now the definitive edition, which has the 550 sections. It's only a problem with that. The original Flight from the Dark, which did not have the Helghast as the last boss, and that gave you many more opportunities to sidestep the Gorgods at the bridge, was much better balanced in my opinion. So that's basically it. This is my review of the definitive edition of Flight from the Dark, which is book one of the Lone Wolf Saga. I hoped you enjoyed a little bit of my thoughts about the book, playing through it, and sort of the pros and cons. I mean, I think future reviews of the books in the series will not be as long, because there's not as much to talk about in that sense, because there's so much to cover here, both as an introduction to the character and the author and sort of the context of it, and also because there's so much to talk about in terms of a different edition, the more detailed version, and then some of the pros and cons of that. So there you go. Until the next book, do take care.